Now for our feature story of the day, here are the highlights from the Trump 2024 Bitcoin Nashville conference. We'll be discussing how high can the Bitcoin price realistically go after Trump's bullish Bitcoin speech, and also be sharing with you verbatim what the highlights were as far as his promises to the Bitcoiners. So let's start with the tweet that I created. You can also see all these headlines. Also, Trump pledges to fire SEC Chair Gary Gensler on day one, which got us, it almost sounded like a standing ovation, and he had to repeat himself twice because it got so many cheers. But nonetheless, Crypto Rover says if Trump gets reelected, that we're going to surpass 813,000 per coin. We'll dive into that here in a moment. But I want to start right here with a tweet that I made yesterday after the speech, along with Trump here. Got 79 hearts and 34 reposts. So thank you, family. So yeah, Donald Trump 2024 Bitcoin conference speech recap. Here are the highlights. On day one, I will fire Gary Gensler and appoint a new SEC chairman, and the crowd goes wild. And he repeats it, and the crowd goes wild again. So I think it's safe to say every Bitcoiner wants Gary to hit the road, Jack, and don't you come back no more, no more, no more, no more. Number two, create a U.S. government strategic national Bitcoin stockpile if elected. Now, he used an interesting choice of word. He used stockpile versus strategic reserve. Is it safe in assuming it's one and the same, or is there a difference there? Can someone chime in and let me know in the chat? Because I did find that odd. He said stockpile, but I'm going to assume he meant strategic reserve asset. Next, he said the U.S. government will keep 100% of the Bitcoin it owns, which is a beautiful thing because, as you know, the U.S. government is one of the largest holders of Bitcoin with over 200,000, which was seized from Mt. Gox. And maybe he's insinuating that all the future Bitcoin they take or seize from criminals, they will keep as well. I mean, why wouldn't you? Now, next, Bitcoin is going to the moon. We all know that one, right? Never sell your Bitcoin. He made a good point to express that. He didn't say the word hodl, but he says, you know what, us Bitcoiners, you never sell your Bitcoin. So shout out to the hodl gang. Next, he said Bitcoin will one day probably surpass the market cap of gold. And like I said, if that happens, very easy, close to $1 million Bitcoin or above. Market cap of gold right now, I'm assuming, is in the ballpark of 16 trillion. Bitcoin market cap is only 1, maybe 0.3 trillion. So it gives us a lot of room for growth. He also says, I reaffirm my pledge to commute Ross Ulbricht's sentence, ultimately insinuating he will free Ross Ulbricht, who is serving a multiple life sentence for being an early Bitcoin adopter, ultimately, in my opinion. And I think that's something we all want as Bitcoiners. I'd love for Ross, you know what would be pretty beautiful? Trump gets reelected. He pardons Ross Ulbricht. And then at the next conference next year, Ross is the keynote speaker. Wow. How crazy would that be, family? Now, next, there will never be a CBDC while I am president of the United States of America. He has shared that previously when he started being pro-Bitcoin and crypto. Ironically, 10 days later, there was an assassination attempt on his life, but he doubled down on that. He says he is against central bank digital currencies, and he will not allow that in the United States. That's music to my ears because we all know what CBDs represent. Slavery to mankind. It's virtually the way of the central bank to enslave you through money that they can program and set an expiration date on, which we want no part of. Bitcoin is the antidote to the CBDC. Now, also, Bitcoin and crypto will skyrocket like never before if elected president. Well, we know Bitcoin will skyrocket like never before, regardless if he is elected president, because that's just what Bitcoin does. And Bitcoin doesn't need Trump. Bitcoin don't need RFK. Bitcoin don't need nobody. Regardless who's in there, even if Sleepy Joe somehow criminally won the re-election, and even though he may not even still be living, and somehow they rigged the system again, Bitcoin is still going to do its thing. You can't stop it. It's a freight train heading to the moon. It's flying. It got wings, baby. But anyways, I digress. Bitcoin is not threatening the dollar. I like this one. The current U.S. government is threatening the dollar. It's because previously, years ago, when Trump used to FUD Bitcoin, he blamed Bitcoin being ultimately that it undermined the value of the dollar. That came from his own mouth a few years ago. So now that he has learned more about Bitcoin, he is willing to admit that it's not Bitcoin that's threatening the dollar. It's the U.S. government threatening the dollar, which is 100% accurate. It's the money printing of the Fed. The more you print, the more the dollar is doomed. So common sense. So respect. The United States will be the crypto capital of the planet and the Bitcoin superpower of the world. Very powerful statement right there. Max disagrees. He says that is impossible to do. And I'll read you the Max quote here in a bit. He also said Bitcoin stands for freedom, sovereignty, and independence from government coercion and control. Facts. Very powerful right there. And he also says, I pledge to the Bitcoin community that the day I take oath of office, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris anti-crypto crusade will be over. And we all know how much they hate and despise Bitcoin because their puppeteers hate and despise Bitcoin because it is the Achilles heel. Ultimately, Bitcoin is the Achilles heel to the central banking cartels in which they stand for and represent. But there you have it. That's the speech from Trump. Now I want to read you some things. Max Keiser responded to my quote of Trump earlier today that I posted, and Max reposted it with the quote, "This is mathematically impossible since Bitcoin is absolutely decentralized, but love Trump jumping into the game theory fray and hopefully getting the U.S. competing in the global hash war I identified in 2019 as the most likely outcome. The other guy's a plagiarist," referring to the guy who wrote that book. I forget the guy's name he's referring to, but yeah, that's Max's feedback on that. Now let's break down some of the headlines, but first here's the tweet from Crypto Rover. Donald Trump said Bitcoin will one day probably surpass the market cap of gold. If this would happen, Bitcoin would be valued at $813,000 per coin. And my question for you guys, by what year, because we all know it's inevitable, by what year will Bitcoin's market cap likely surpass the 16 trillion market cap of gold? Holla at your boy. And also, again, Trump pledges to fire SEC chairman day one if reelected, which, again, got the most claps that I heard during that speech, and you guys watched it with me. But now let's speculate a little more, eh? One of the boldest and most bullish outlooks for Bitcoin after Trump's speech comes from independent market analyst Dan DeRover. The chartist, who goes by the name or moniker Crypto Rover, expects the price to surpass 800,000 if Trump is elected once again in November, particularly since Trump stated that Bitcoin may overtake gold's market cap in the future. And I just read you his quote. He could see Bitcoin hitting 813,000 if the Bitcoin market cap were to surpass gold at 16 trillion. Also, as I shared earlier, Republican Senator Cynthia Lummis of Wyoming adds to the bullish outlook. She presented the legislative proposal to establish an official U.S. Federal Reserve of 1 million BTC over the next 5 years, which is almost 5% of the circulating Bitcoin supply. Actually, even more, 5% of the total 21 million supply. An excerpt from her address: Bitcoin will be held for a minimum of 20 years, the 20-year HODL strategy, and then can be used for one purpose: reduce our debt. Let's see if the Fed has an intention to really reduce the debt or not, hey? The U.S. government already holds 210,000 biddies worth over $14 billion. Trump promised to allocate those holdings to the U.S. Treasury, adding that his government, if elected, will never, ever dump them. Never, because it's going up forever, Laura. But there you have it, yo. That's the latest with the updates. Now you've heard the most important things that went down from the event from Michael Saylor, Cynthia Lummis, Max Keiser, and RFK Jr. So let me know your thoughts and feedback. And who do you think had the best speech? And do you think they'll stick to their promises? Let me know, and I'll read your comments out loud.